second session. I just would like to ask the members of the Van Leer workshop to remain after the session is ended. We have an informal gathering just here. So just stay right where you are and don't go anywhere after this ends. This session, the second session, is called Security Sector's Impact on Policymaking. We have 4 speakers. I will introduce the first speaker now, Samy Cohen, Professor Samy Cohen. He's Research Director at the Center for International Studies and Research at the Institute for Political Sciences. He's interested in, his areas of interest are civil military relations in Israel and in France, the ethics of war and the fight against terrorism. His most recent publication is The Resilience of the State, Democracy and the Challenges of Globalization, 2006. And he has published many works and chapters and articles on civil military relations and other security-related matters. So the floor is yours.
I would like first to apologize, as my English, as you will very soon see, is not so brilliant as all the intervenants of this morning. And the second point is even worse. My hearing is not very good, even catastrophic. So if you had a question, please ask them a little bit loudly. Thank you very much. So I would like to start to clarify what I mean by civilian control. What sort of concerns does it refer? It usually involves worrying about the excessive influence the army might gain over elected civil authorities. So I refer explicitly to the control of political authorities on militaries, not in a broader sense of civil society's control. A vast body of literature has been devoted to Israeli civil-military relations. Some authors have insisted heavily on the dangers of excessive military power, directly mentioning not only the risk of Praetorianism, of a military coup, but also the militarization of the Israeli society. They refer to the significant place the army occupies in Israel society, its ascendancy over civilian leaders, and the latter's inability to counterbalance their influence. Other analysts have even wondered if the attempt putsch perpetrated by 4 French generals in April 1961 in Algiers against General de Gaulle might not happen in Israel. The rise in power of religious soldiers wearing kippa sruga, Stuart, how do you say in English? Nikit kippa, thank you. Close to the West Bank settlers, is thought to threaten Israeli society with a similar coup in order to prevent the government from withdrawing from the West Bank. This paper attempts a comparison between France and Israel. This comparison can teach us a lot, I hope so, about the capacity of civilian control over the army in Israel. But should this comparison be restricted to the period of the Fourth Republic, wouldn't a comparison with the Fifth Republic be more interesting? Since the study cannot deal with all the aspects of a country's military activity, I will confine myself to one of them, the decision to use force in the course of external military interventions. I would like to I'll build my presentation around 4 questions. First of them, what was the model of the civil-military relation in the Third and the Fourth Republic? Second, can Sahel be compared to the French army during these 2 political regimes? Third question, is any risk of a French-style putsch in Israel? Fourth question, can Sahel be compared to the Fifth Republic, to the army of the Fifth Republic, of course? So I start with my first question. The relation between political authorities and the army were for a long time governed by a basic and written rule. The army did not get involved in politics, and in exchange, the government did not interfere with the running of military affairs except through military budget allocation. This was particularly true from the 1920s. This unwritten pact, in fact, granted the military a large influence over foreign and defense policy. I quoted here Albert Sarraut, who was, at the time of the Rhineland crisis, he was Prime Minister in France, and he said, when the war was over, I quote, statesmen and heads of government still feared to tread on military ground, either to make certain inquiries or to issue certain authoritarian directives. There was a realm with which to them seem off limits, so to speak. It's stupid, but that's how it is, and that was the realm of strategy. We had not the right to interfere in that area, and when from time to time a statesman took the liberty of passing judgments on the military that weren't strictly budgetary, you shouldn't see how the press immediately raised a sting, declared, what is it? The military knows its business. You don't know, it's like they do. Keeps your nose out of this. The Fourth Republic only partially remedied this weakness. Wars in Indochina and Algeria were waged contrary to the precepts of Clausewitzian theories, which subordinates the military viewpoint to the political viewpoint. According to the author of On War, it is policy that has created war. Policy is the guiding intelligence and war only the instrument, not vice versa. Clausewitz believed that the cabinet had not professional soldiers who should determine the main lines of action in a war, for only the cabinet has intimate knowledge of the political situation. In the Algerian war, the army was invested with heavy responsibilities, re-establishing order, reconquering the Muslim population by psychological means, cutting the population off from the rebel faction, seeking its support, convincing it to take the side of France. From that point on, disappointed by the political establishment which had failed in its duty in Indochina and had robbed soldiers on military victory in Suez in 1956, the army became wary. It began to evolve outside all political control, making successful pacification its personal affair. The principles of subordination were openly and publicly scoffed with no reaction from the political authorities. At the first hints of abandon in May 1958, the army put pressure on political authorities to keep the French flag flying in Algeria. On May 13th, the army openly challenged the political leadership and proclaimed its wish to see de Gaulle, the sole person capable in his eyes of opposing French withdrawal from Algeria, return to power. Unhappy with the turn taken by de Gaulle's policy as of 1960 with his speech on self-determination, a segment of the army in Algeria decided to take control and took the oath that there is no independent Algeria and there will never be. Naturally, the second question is, can Sahel be compared to the French army during the Third and the Fourth Republic? First of all, I will point out that for what all of you already know, all the armies in democratic countries, the Israeli army has one of the greatest potential for influence. The Israeli army enjoys strong popularity among the population. The generals are respected figures and promise to high government position when they return to civilian life. Maybe this last election it was a little bit different, but in the long term that was more or less the unwritten rule. A dispute between the Prime Minister and the Ramatkal, the army chief of the general staff, is very unlikely to lead to the eviction of the latter. But none of the great Israeli army leaders has, to my knowledge, denied the principle of military subordination to the political sphere. Most of the time, Israeli prime ministers have imposed their will on decisions involving strategy. None of them, to my knowledge, has affirmed that we don't have the right to interfere in army business, as Albert Sarraut stated with respect to relations between the French government and the army under the Third Republic. The history of the State of Israel is full of examples of disputes between the Prime Minister or the Defense Minister and their Chief of General Staff that ended to the detriment of the latter. In all cases of disagreement, the army submitted and loyally enforced government decisions. The Israeli army never had the influence the French army had in the past. The civil authorities can reject army proposals or make decisions without first asking for their opinion. True, their ability to control is not limitless. They do not have particularly developed means to intrude in the military sphere. The Foreign Affairs and Security Commission, the Knesset, plays a minor role. But the Israeli government is not hostage of its military. The Israeli army, like the French army, is not monolithic. The Prime Minister and his Defense Minister can go into the field and directly question brigade commander, shortcutting the military high command. And as in any democratic army, military officials also think in terms of their career and know that advancement may depend on the loyalty they show toward the civil authorities. And I know most of you read the book of Irving Janis, Victim of Groupthink. The groupthink syndrome must not be ruled out either. When an expert is faced with a decision maker having a strong personality, he tends to present options that are likely to comfort the general preferences of the latter. Influence is not always one way, going from the expert to the policymaker. The policymaker. The opposite often exists. Moreover, the Army's geostrategic analyses are not always innovative. They are often commonplace or else a reflection of the Prime Minister's well-known position. I get to my third question. Is any risk of French-type putsch in Israel? The notion of army intervention in politics cannot be totally discarded. Military intrusion is always possible in democratic society in the event of political chaos, as Samuel Huntington points out in his study on the sources of Praetorianism. But one might ask, why generals promised to lead the country one day would take power by force? Why would they take the risk of making themselves so unpopular? But some analysts retort, the risk would come from the rise in power of religious elements within the army. If such officers were a majority, they might be tempted to refuse to obey orders to evacuate Judea and Samaria and take power by force. This would be a very comparable scenario to the Algiers putsch in April 1961. But in my opinion, this comparison is not relevant for two reasons. The first one is that for a putsch to succeed, political authority must first be unable to govern. Its perpetrators must have serious backing within the army, in particular and especially among the conscripts, without whom it would be impossible to take power. It would also require support among the population. The Israeli people would not forgive a coup unless the Orthodox faction already held a majority in the country. For the past several years, a majority of the Israelis has been in favor of withdrawal from the occupied territories and the creation of a Palestinian state. They massively supported withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. A military coup, obviously, would not have popular support in these circumstances, even if the army command were from the Orthodox religious community. And the second reason, let's not forget to specify that in 1961, in Algiers, it was not a coup that took place, but an attempted putsch, which was a total failure. The four generals, Salon, Jouot, Zeller, and Charles, de Gaulle spoke about them, about the Quarteron des Généraux. It was very spiteful to speak about the Quarteron des Généraux, the little four generals. They enjoyed only feeble support. The French population on the other side of the Mediterranean shore was largely behind de Gaulle. The press in mainland France backed de Gaulle. The conscripts displayed clearly hostility toward the felons. I wonder if a comparison between France and Israel can build on such a rickety example. I get to my fourth question. Can Sahel be compared to the army of the Fifth Republic? The Fifth Republic brought a major turnabout in relations between political authorities and military officers. The political order overrides the military order, thereby confirming the triumph of Clausewitzian theory. The head of state has become the de facto commander-in-chief of the armed forces that he always should have been. With de Gaulle and the Fifth Republic, political authorities assumed responsibility for the main policy guidelines without necessarily seeking the advice of military officers. Compared to Sahel, this army has not acquired such a strong influence over national politics. It lives on the fringes of civil society and has not managed to communicate its values to it. Its influence on foreign policy is minimal. Rare are the generals who have sought to play a role in the country's general policy. And like in the French Fifth Republic, Israeli generals play a major role in public debates. They openly express their viewpoint even when it differs from the Prime Minister. I don't know if you remember, in February 9, 2006, General Yair Naveh, Aluf Pikud Merkaz, I don't know how you say, the chief of the Central Command, expressed offensive opinions regarding the King of Jordan's chances for political survival, thus damaging the Israeli government's position without being severely reprimanded for it. In the Fifth Republic, this sort of behavior is inconceivable. The few audacious generals who have dared to criticize the government were dismissed. The army is the big mute. In Israel, the army has a virtual monopoly on strategic thinking. Any strategic evaluation made by the head of Haman, Israeli military intelligence, carries considerable weight in the public debate without this influence being systematic or always decisive. The head of Haman is considered to be the national evaluator, as many authors used to say. In France, apart from a few officers on the fringes of the army high command in the early days of the Fifth Republic, there have been no great strategists among the chief of the staff. The army has left this activity to diplomats and to the benefit of senior civil servants at the Defense Ministry. The instruments for counter-expertise are weaker in Israel than in France. There are no major meetings of the High Command bringing together civilians and military staff, as in the case in France, every time a major international crisis arises and in which France is involved, at the time, for example, of 1991 Gulf War, of the one of the Kosovo War in 1997. I would like now to get to the conclusion and to arrive quickly 3 points. First of them, the model of relation between political authorities and the army in Israel is without doubt closer to the model of civil-military relation under the Fifth Republic. In both cases, the primacy of civilian power is not called into question. All strategic decisions about the use of armed forces are made by the government and in particular by the Prime Minister in Israel and by the President in France. Yet, it should be pointed out that there is far from total symbiosis between the two models. The main difference is that in Israel, the army is invested with a crushing responsibility to ensure the country's survival. Public opinion finds it normal for generals to speak their minds in public. Second point is an attempt to compare the advantages and disadvantages of the two models, of the Fifth Republic and the Israeli one. The Israeli situation, I would like to point the main disadvantage of the Israeli situation. I think it is rather unhealthy for a general from Amman to define the country's strategic priorities in public or how to interpret a threat, because he doesn't possess all the facts about domestic and international politics to intervene in such an important subject for a nation's future. An error on his part could have serious consequences, as happened during the Yom Kippur War. It is a job that falls under the responsibility of the political authorities. The French situation seems to adhere more closely to the democratic ideal of an army subordinated to the civil authority. One should, however, beware of an over-idyllic vision of civil-military relations in France, which also has its disadvantages. Subordinations had led to a certain degree of irresponsibility at the military level. Subordination does not, moreover, imply wholesale adhesion and does not preclude a certain dose of wariness. The political and the military spheres have not entered a marriage of love, but one of reason. Third and last point is about the status of the military in the two countries. The status of the military is less prestigious in France, of course, than in Israel, but few military personnel complain about it. This situation has two advantages. The first is that in the event that a strategic option fails, it is not the military that will pay the price. Strategy, due to the status of France as a nuclear power, is defined by the head of state. The second advantage is that the army's declining influence has brought about an increase in the population's sympathy for the armed forces and reduced the predominant anti-militarism of the past. On the other hand, and I will conclude with these few words, on the other hand, Tzahal prestige seems in decline. Israel has in the past several years been experiencing protest movements among civil society. Soldiers' Mother, Israeli Soldier Protest Association, human rights NGOs, etc. Tzahal, in a way, is probably paying the debt of its strong influence and the often excessive use of violence that it has shown in the occupied territories. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take a few questions now. We have very little comment.
Can you turn on the last slide?
Which one? Conclusion?
The last one.
Okay.
This is more of a comment than a question. In Israel, Amman is not responsible for defining the country's strategic priorities. This is not the role of Amman. Amman is the intelligence branch which is responsible for military evaluations, but not strategic priorities. For that purpose, we have another branch within the IDF headquarters, which is the planning branch.
The what? Excuse me?
We have another branch that is responsible
Yes.
for the strategic priority,
Yes.
which is the planning branch,
Yes.
not the intelligence.
Okay.
That's it.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you very much. But well, yes, I would like. Thank you very much for this criticism.
It's not criticism.
I was very impressed by the speeches of Amman a few weeks ago. The chief of Amman made a statement, and it was in the first page, in the front page of Haaretz. The chief of Amman said, and that seems to be a very the media and probably the establishment give a very strong importance to the statement of Amman. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
It was the former chief of Amman, which spoke in conference, not what is in his duty. It was the former.
Yeah.
The previous
He's
chief.
not in duty now.
Okay.
The subject you will see
Yeah.
in the paper.
Let's go back to what happened to the Yom Kippur War. Excuse me. Back to what happened to the Yom Kippur War. As far as I know, the evaluation, the political evaluation, was established on the evaluation of Amman. Maybe the situation has changed. And you are right.
One of the lessons learned from the Yom Kippur War
Yeah.
is that it was established this planning branch.
Okay.
The
Thank you.
planning branch was established as a result of the Yom Kippur.
Okay.
The same issue? Yeah. Okay, so if it's the exact same issue, then go ahead.
Amir, I think you're answering as a military officer.
Which
And I think,
which I am.
you know, I'm granting you all the status that's accompanying that. I think that Samy's point was sociological. And Amman, as part of a network of ties with the strategic planning department, with politicians and so on, has a central role in actually deciding the strategic priorities. I think that was Samy's point. Not formally, wait a second. It's interesting that all the Israeli men take all these things as criticisms. What is important is not that, according to doctrine or the formal role. You're right, you're correct. But if Samy's point is sociological, his point still stands in terms of the military having a role that's very different, much more central than in other countries. And that is bad.
Okay, Gabby, yes.
Well, I will continue what Eyal just said. But let me first say that it seems that you disagree with the paper that we presented, and you present a different kind of explanation. I think that I should have been more blunt in my statement. You see, the point is that prime ministers, according to our interpretation, prime ministers, most of the prime ministers in Israel were part of what we call the network, the security network. They were not civilian. And see what happened to some of the prime ministers that were quote-unquote purely civilian. See Sharet. What happened with Sharet? The army didn't give a damn about what Sharet was saying, you know, in launching all these attacks. Look what happened to Eshkol. He, you know, was also a pure civilian prime minister. See what happened to him in the Six-Day War.
What happened?
And
What happened?
what happened? The military pushed him part of this network. Until now, Amir Peretz probably will be different, and we'll see what's happened. But you see the statement by Amir Peretz until now, and you can see what is the general direction of this.
It was driven totally by generals. He said it. It's written in his biography.
Right.
He was driven only by generals.
Right.
Can you allow me to give a short response to Gabi? First of all, okay, yeah. Gabi, first of all, your work, as far as I understood, your work of this morning is much more wide and general. I was speaking about the use of force and military interventions. When you speak about networks, but there is always an interdependency between the political authorities and the military authorities. They have to work together. The political authorities cannot take a decision without having the advice of the militaries, and in this way the militaries can influence, but they do not always influence in a decisive matter. You gave certain examples, but there are many other examples where the political authorities take the decision contrary to the advice of the military. Took the withdrawal from Lebanon. Took the
Barak was a civilian.
yes. Well, excuse me. Let's in France, we doesn't use civilian authorities, civil-military relation. We use political-military relation. And I was in Stanford, and they asked me, why do you use the political and not civilian? But I said, because de Gaulle was a general, but he is the political authority. I think there is maybe a confusion about this term of civil-military relation. I would prefer to speak about political-military relation. Barak was the political authority, as Sharon became the political authority. And I think that all these generals, Barak, Sharon, at many times, they took decisions contrary to the advice of the head of the Ramatkal, took the retreat from the Gaza Strip. Bughi Alon was against. There are many examples in this way. Yes, please.
I have a question about setting the priorities. I heard a lecture by Shlomo Yanai who said that in France there was a white paper that defined, in fact, a new French army where the whole tanks force more or less was dismantled, etc., etc. And his point was that in Israel, no civilian will agree to set the priorities for the armies.
Well, that's true. Yes, I think that that's true. The white paper, which has been written in 1944, I think, 43, has been written by a group with a mix of civilian and militaries, and the two main how do you say, redactors, the authors, the two main authors. One of them was a general, and the other one was a civilian, and this was the result of a work, and in all decision to send forces abroad for the Gulf War, Kosovo, many other crises, Bosnia. There are groups who work together, civilian. I didn't see such a thing here. Maybe I didn't see it. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe I didn't see everything. I don't have the feeling that there is sort of cooperation between civilians, civil servants, and military in case of decision to send forces abroad.
This is a little bit off, but I just was wondering, the French military, have they had any point of view or public point of view regarding the effect on France and the French military industry of the boycott that de Gaulle declared in '67 before the Six-Day War? As you know, later on, Israel went over to American arms, and Israel is the best salesperson for American arms. American arms are very popular because of the success of Israeli army. So, has the fact that the French lost the Israeli salesmanship, has that affected the French arms industry, and has it caused any resentment among any groups in France? And what does the French army think about? What's their attitude towards Israel when the government generally is a little anti-Israel, or is the army a little more pro-Israel?
Well, yes, it does affect the complex military industry. When de Gaulle take the decision he took in June '67, but a few years later, this influence was evaporated because the French military industries found another markets, as you know. First it was in Libya, and then Iraq, and well, today, if you ask militaries or political leaders, the French foreign ministry, generals, they say, well, in the balance is in favor of marketing with Arab countries, of course. At the beginning, it was that they feel this, and especially Dassault, they feel that decision as a coup, yes, a blow against them. But several years ago, all this was forgotten completely. You had, and then another question about '67. Your second question.
Well, I mentioned about the boycott, and I still feel that France lost because Israel feeds America a lot of technical know-how, and I think that if you compare the French military machine with the Americans have a great advantage, and part of the advantage, I believe, is because of what happens in the battlefield and so forth. And I think that the French pride is such that they would never admit that they lost this know-how from Israel.
Yes, you're probably right. I would like just to add something that I think that de Gaulle and probably his successors, they made a strong political mistake to cut relations with Israel, because they have lost all influence, all political influence in the Middle East. They have gained markets. They can sell much more to the Arab countries than to Israel. But they have completely lost the political influence, as they cannot discuss, they cannot put pressure on Israel. They don't have the confidence of the political leaders in Israel. So they are out of the game now.
Our second speaker is Zalman Shiffer, who is an independent economic advisor and researcher. He has been economic advisor at the Israel National Security Council and chief economist and advisor to the director of research at the Bank of Israel. He's interested in exchange rate regimes and monetary policy and defense economics, and he has recently published The Cost of Living Allowance as an Instrument for the Preservation of Real Wages Against Inflationary Surprises. So I hope he's full of surprises today as well. And
okay, my subject is the debate over the defense budget in Israel. And, well, given Israel's geopolitical situation, the size of resources diverted to defense, the implications for the safety, the economy and society, it's not surprising that the questions relating to the defense budget have a central position in the Israeli public discourse. Although I may add that the debate is not necessarily always very efficient or convincing. Now, the major issues, let me start by mentioning the major issues and the participants, and then go a bit deeper into the issues. Well, the major issues, as I see them, one is the size of the defense budget, which means, in economic terms, choosing the optimal combination of the costs of security and insecurity. Given its geopolitical situation, Israel is bearing a burden, whether it is investing in defense or not. Investing more in defense means reducing the cost of insecurity. The solution should be one which minimizes the joint cost of security and insecurity. And of course, what is that mix is debatable. Second issue is the structure and operation of the defense budget. And the third is the balance of power and responsibility in the defense budgeting process. Now, the list of participants in the debate is large, but not all of them have equal power, equal influence, and equal willingness to accept responsibility. Well, this list includes the Army, the IDF, the Ministry of Defense, the Treasury, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, under which wings we find also the National Security Council, about which I will have more to say later, the Knesset, the domestic defense industries and other suppliers to the Army. Well, as an homage to some former authors, the defense networks, advisors, gurus, and partners. And finally, with a weak but increasing voice, the media, academia, and general public. Now let me start with the size of the defense budget and give you a few stylized facts. We are talking about a $10 billion defense expenditure bill for an economy of about $120 billion, which is about 8%, a very high ratio in international comparison. Some of it is financed, about a quarter of this burden is financed by US military assistance, which means that the direct cost to the country is lower. Still, it is high in international terms. If we make a comparison, Israel is spending on defense the same dollar amount as Canada, Australia, or Turkey. Half of Saudi Arabia, but the same as the 4 countries surrounding it. Well, that's a bit misleading because prices there are different. But anyway, Israel is among the 15 highest spenders on security in dollar terms, not in real terms, in dollar terms. Now, and of course, most Western countries spend about 2 or 3% of their GDP on defense, as against 8% for Israel. Now, contrary to what some people may feel, Israel defense expenditures are not at their peak right now. In the mid-1970s, real defense outlays were 20% higher than today, and the share of defense in GDP was more than 30%, as against 8% today. It is still high by international standards. Now, that's not the focus of my presentation, but let me mention the major considerations relating to the size of the defense budget. Well, of course, the nature, probability, and significance of the threats, the potential responses, their efficiency and adaptability. The point of adaptability is important because of the long time constant associated with some military buildup and investment. Third point, which is very important and debatable, is the interaction between threats and responses. What is going to happen if Israel cuts its defense expenditures? Are a rival going to follow her or take care of the opportunity and increase their spendings? That's really a dilemma between two models of arm race. The one of destabilizing escalation, and the other one is the Star War model, as I call it, the model according to which the US has been able to break Russia's willingness to rival it in the arms race. Then we have the alternative cost of defense and externalities. What does the defense expenditures do to the civilian economy? Now, there are okay. Some of the points mentioned here are of macroeconomic nature, saying that, well, when you invest more in defense, the economy is booming. I believe that that's a weak argument, because you can increase activity in other ways. The other one is more subtle and probably true. That's the microeconomic effect of the defense industries. Now, again, we could have made similar advances by civilian ways. It is a bit of a sad observation about the Israeli economy that the military industries may be more efficient than some of the civilian, or have been in the past. Well, turning to the structure and operation of the defense budget, the issues are the division of labor between defense and other budgets. What is the responsibility of the military versus that of other ministries? And what part of defense expenditures is or should be borne by other ministries? The other is totally professional, the structure of the defense forces, air force against ground power. I have nothing to contribute here. The third is the flexibility and efficiency. How can one, we discussed it at lunch, how can one increase the efficiency of the military outlays? And what about multi-annual budgets? Of course, since many of the Army's activities are long-term, it is very important and convenient for the Army to have multi-annual budgets, like it has multi-annual plans. But what does it mean? It means that every unexpected event, both in terms of risks, of demands, and both in terms of means of production, would have to be borne by other sectors, meaning pushing all the cost of adjustment on the shoulders of others. Is it optimal? Or does one have to find some compromise, taking into account that adjusting health investment is also costly? And finally, the Army standard of living. Do the Army servicemen get a rent? Do they get more than is required? Or is it necessary to pay them that much in order to have the right kind of people serving in the Army? Turning to the balance of power in the budget preparation process. Here the ingredients are like a good roman. Power, knowledge, resources, motivation, and willingness to accept responsibility. The willingness to accept responsibility is, for, as I see it, a very major ingredient, because I'm concerned that civilian authorities are often keen to avoid responsibility. It's so convenient to have the military make the big decisions. I'm not sure that, say, at the cabinet level or at the parliament level, people are really willing in spite of all their complaining, are really willing to accept the responsibility and invest the resources required. Now, the major confrontation is between the Ministry of Defense and the Treasury Budget Division boys. Here we have two groups of highly motivated individuals who know every trick in the field, are very committed to the values which they appreciate, but, okay, have a different agenda, of course. One of the points is choosing between inputs and outputs. The Treasury says, well, guys, that's what we can give you. We are going to make the best of it. The military says, okay. If you want enough security, okay, that's our plan, that's it, and that's what we are going to pay. Otherwise, well, you are in a problem. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet, they do not invest in learning so much the situation, but the buck stops there. The Prime Minister is the one who makes the decision. And all the rest are hardly relevant, especially the Knesset. Now, let me cite on these issues, let me cite the State Controller report to show you how bad it is. Okay, says the State Controller, less than a year ago, the Treasury budget preparation process is not regulated by a clear and systematic procedural framework and is not supported by a comprehensive staff work. The IDF and the Ministry of Defense do not investigate the economic implications of changes in their working plans and do not compare them to alternatives. The Treasury has not established formal reporting requirements for the Ministry of Defense and does not control adequately its creation of multi-annual obligations. The Prime Minister's office, including the National Security Council, has no meaningful role in the staff work preceding the defense budget decision-making. The deliberations over the defense budget with the Prime Minister's participation are dominated by the analysis and data provided by the Ministry of Defense. The Treasury is not able to check this data and analysis, and as nobody else has the authority to do so, there is an over-reliance on the material provided by the defense sector. And last, the Prime Minister conducts two parallel sets of budgetary deliberations, a formal one leading to the discussion and ratification of the budget by the Knesset, and the other dealing with the de facto defense expenditures, including the different supplements. And the Controller concludes this state of affairs undermines parliamentary control. Okay, turning to recent development, the Intifada and the period thereafter gave two opposing insights to people interested. One is the cost of insecurity. All of a sudden, the cost of insecurity became very clear. But on the other hand, we also saw the cost of investing too much in government spending, including defense. Remember that we started with a defense crisis, went to the edge of a financial crisis, and finished with a social crisis. So while in the first 2 years of the Intifada, there was an agreement that defense expenditures should be increased, thereafter we saw a world war between the defense and the treasury, with differences reaching a quarter of the defense budget, something unheard of. Now, this frustration about this state of affairs and the shallowness of the discussion has led to efforts to improve the situation, to deal with the process, not with its solution, but with the process. We have had the Israel Democracy Institute deliberations. We have had the government controller report, which I've quoted. We have had several parliamentary committees. Recently, one can speak very feebly of a certain shifting of the agenda. There was a strengthening of the social lobby and a lot of talk about defense cut suggestions from people who have not really investigated the questions, but know that we have to cut the defense budget by 10% or something like this. Now, for me, it's the same sin as saying that we must increase the defense budget. Okay, I don't know what should be done with the defense budget. I know that it should be investigated more seriously. Also, there was some progress in civilian participation, but, like the two ministries which come from outside the network, etc., etc. I'm not sure where it leads. Now, let me start concluding. Situation is such, okay, as I said, I'm not going to pass a judgment over the optimal size of the defense budget. I don't think that one can do it right now. What I can say is that neither the cabinet nor the specialized Knesset committees have adequate access to a real-time, clear, and well-balanced integrative presentation of the major security issues, the possible alternative courses of action, and their implications. The input of the civilian decision makers to some of the most important issues relating to the security and well-being of the Israeli citizens, as well as to their future, is poor and inadequate, and the control of the legislative authority over the executive loses much of its meaning. Some recommendation and a quick final concluding remark. Okay, impose a structured, cooperative, and integrative budget preparation process on the party. Force them to sit together and to submit, stage by stage, their papers. Give central status to the National Security Council, more than has been given right now. Invest in high-quality staff everywhere. Listen, the Treasury is employing 3.5 economists to deal with the defense establishment. And the Knesset, of course, is employing less of that. Create a lingua franca and enforce transparency. Well, it's so difficult to really understand what the military budget and to see over it, to be able to contribute to rational decision making. Build mechanisms to improve incentives and flexibility. And finally, let me repeat it, confront the issues, the real issues, and be willing to accept responsibility. And my concluding remark is that more is involved here than the mere improvement of the security and budgetary decision process and of the parliamentary control of the executive. We are too often confronted with situations in which the civilian sector in Israel is considered incompetent or unwilling to accept responsibility, and the military or the veteran military are called to the rescue. This is a grave system failure which prevents Israel from fully achieving its potential, reduces the incentive for professionalism and excellence in the civilian sector, and prevents Israel from fully developing its civil society and achieving a proper balance and division of labor between the different parts of society. I think that this should be corrected. Thank you.
In your activities, have you suggested or have you come across what's called experts on what they call time and efficiency engineering? They say there's a lot of waste in the Defense Department. Are there some well-known efficiency experts that have gone through the various departments and have seen what is done, or they can, if the defense, the various defense departments can be run a little more efficiently with less waste. And then number two, there are many people, many economists who say that actually the defense budget should be increased, at least the research, because that feeds defense industries, which help employment and also increases exports. So if you could make a comment on that.
Well, what was the first part about efficiency?
How were the efficiency experts eliminated efficiently from...
Oh, yeah, okay. Look, okay, I'm not going to, to say anything about my knowledge or experience. I can say as an economist that people react to incentives. Okay, what you should do is to confront the military with the proper prices, and then they are going to be efficient. Okay, it's not for us, for outsiders, to come and inquire and make suggestions. Okay, they should have their constraints, and they should act according to the true prices. Because okay, if for example you do not pay for a conscript, or you pay very little for a conscript soldier, okay, you are going to waste that resource. If you have to pay the alternative market price, you are going to use it more efficiently. So here what you have to do is to impose true prices on the military. I refer to the question of augmenting, of a positive effect on exports and industry, etc., etc. I said that, okay, in terms of technology, apparently the military industries have had an important contribution, and deplored that this has not happened through civilian activity. About the level of production of GDP and exports, etc., etc., I believe that there are alternative civilian ways to promote them, and we don't need the military for that. Some of the best doing countries in the world do not rely on defense expenditures to reach full employment, higher employment than we have.
Any more questions?
Yes. You didn't want to refer to. I'm an economist, so now you know on what side I am. And
Some of my best friends.
The question which is always posed is the strategic questions. Whether the fact that the balance of risks that Israel is facing in terms of their costs are different, because it's true that we now have different risks, but basically the Eastern Front is all but gone. So doesn't that mean something about the need to restructure the army in a way that might save money or not?
Well, you're asking too much from me. Okay. Evidently, if the Eastern Front has disappeared forever, the optimal size of defense expenditures should probably be lower. Okay, I don't know that we were at that optimal size. In addition, I don't know for how many years the Eastern Front has disappeared. How long will it take to rebuild the force needed to confront such a front? So your question is very well taken. I don't feel that they have the expertise to answer it. I'm afraid that someone else thinks that they know the answer.
Okay, our third speaker is Ronald Krebs, Professor Ronald Krebs. He's assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of Fighting for Rights, Military Service and the Politics of Citizenship, published by Cornell University Press, 2006. He's working on a major research project exploring the effects of war on democratic institutions and processes. And he's also interested in IR theory, international relations theory, international security, the sociology of war and military service, rhetorical contestation and framing, and counterterrorism. So we welcome you.
Thank you very much, Oren, and thanks. And unlike some others who are presenting works in progress, I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not actually presenting a work in progress. And what I'm presenting is work that's more or less finished. So, throw your criticisms, but the work's in print. At least so Cornell University Press tells me. No, but I'm still interested in these questions, and undoubtedly you'll help shape my thinking. And Oren also thankfully gave me a bit of a plug, and I'll give myself a shameless plug. And what I'm going to try to do over the next 20 minutes or so is give you a sense of a 300-page book in about 20 minutes. And if I'm successful, then maybe some of you will go and actually go to Amazon and buy the book. So that'll be available this summer. Talking about military service, citizenship, and nationhood. In the optimistic heyday of decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s, militaries were widely saluted by practitioners and scholars alike as modernizing and nationalizing forces that would help new countries overcome communal rifts. And of course, as all of you are well aware, among the countries that was most avid in this was Israel, right? So David Ben-Gurion referred to the IDF as the workshop of the new Israeli society. The IDF would be a key institution charged with assimilating Jews from all around the world and, frankly, propagating the Zionist orthodoxy. Underpinning all of this talk in the 1950s and 1960s, and, by the way, very much since, it's still very much with us, is an old belief dating back to Republican Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome, that the military is a key institution for the labeling and transmission of social values, a means of creating a unifying identity, transcending regional and communal cleavages. You see this in Plato, Machiavelli, Hegel, Max Weber, and many, many other social theorists. And yet this claim is often simply assumed. Its logic is rarely explored. It's surprising that there's relatively little scholarly literature that actually addresses these questions. Few sociologists, historians, or political scientists have doubted that the armed forces would dramatically reshape society for good or for ill, and even fewer have unpacked and assessed the underlying causal logic and evaluated these claims in light of the available evidence. So the question I'd like to speak about, mostly theoretically, at the request of the conference organizers, and then just a flavor of the empirics toward the very end, though I'm happy to talk about them more in the question and answer period, is what are the conditions under which the military may shape the national political community? When and how does the design of the armed forces, and specifically the military's manpower policies, shape the politics, and I stress the politics, of nation building? Now, the existing literature on this question is sparse, but embedded are three seemingly plausible mechanisms. One of them has to do with socializations of the masses to military norms, the notion being that because the military is often presumed to be, in Irving Goffman's terms, a total institution, and because soldiers generally serve during what psychologists call their impressionable years, the armed forces may effectively socialize both in subtle ways and through explicit indoctrination the rank and file and officers to national norms reflected in the institution's policies. Second approach, rooted in sort of what social psychologists like to call the contact hypothesis, is that this contact hypothesis may operate particularly effectively within a military context by bringing together all of these people from all kinds of different backgrounds, classes, races, ethnicities, religions, regions, in an institutional setting that is hierarchical and is conducive to cooperation, or in fact requires cooperation, that that's going to help them escape their parochial commitments, leading them to see themselves as constitutive pieces of a larger project. Not surprisingly, this has been particularly popular in liberal states like the United States, where people don't want to think of the military as a coercive in the sense of socialization, but simply bringing people together so they recognize the commonality that binds them. In the United States, the U.S. World War II military has been widely acclaimed, for example, as having brought the military melting pot to fruition. And finally, we have elite transformation, which is really quite agnostic as to whether socialization or contact is the critical causal mechanism, but says what's critical is that the military helps shape future elites, that for a variety of reasons, those who have military service may be most likely to be politically influential elites to have positions of influence from which they may then shape the way in which the nation as a whole defines, apprehends their social world. Equally briefly, I just want to talk about some flaws in these models before moving on to my own approach. One is that this actually has relatively passive conceptions of how it is that people's identities are formed. Actors here are highly passive in both the socialization model and, to an extent, in the second mechanism of the contact hypothesis. Cultural systems, however, as we know, always contain enough contradictory material so that individuals can challenge hegemonic projects. So in fact, studies done by military sociologists have generally found that soldiers rarely, in fact, take the messages away, the lessons that the military would have liked. Second, is the kinds of lessons that are learned, even if they are effective, even if our actors are passive, are they portable across social contexts. Imagine that the military were an effective inculcator of values. Individuals may very well behave more or less as the military likes when they're subject to the strictures of military life. But when they move outside of the military, do they take that with them? Identities, we know, people don't have a single identity, they have identities. And identities are inherently contextual. Soldiers, in fact, we know, often adopt regional, class, ethnic, regional perspectives when they are out base or out of uniform, or when they have returned to civilian life. And in fact, data on the U.S. military bears this out. Third, even if the military was an effective inculcator of values, even if it was portable across social contexts, will the effects be long-lasting? And there's reason to think, in fact, that they're not having to do with social networks, and I don't want to take time here to talk about that in the Q&A if you like. What about the contact hypothesis? Well, the contact hypothesis, after 50 years of research, remains causally indeterminate. Is it the case? We know that people who tend to have more contact with each other tend to like each other more. But do they have more contact with each other because they like each other more already? Or is it rather they like each other more because they have more contact with each other? In other words, classic problems of endogeneity that have never really been sorted out, even after 50 years of research. So I think we say that research programs in serious trouble. And finally, and most importantly from my perspective, and will lead us into the next question, has to do with the individualist conception of identity that more or less underlies all of these embedded models. Both the socialization and the contact mechanisms, and to a lesser extent the elite transformation model, suggest that the boundaries of nationality are drawn and redrawn as individuals' attitudes change in the military crucible. From this perspective, identity, both personal and national, is cognitive and subjective. It's a matter of individual consciousness, and in the case of the nation, think of lots of individual consciousnesses simply aggregated, added together. However, identity is necessarily social, not the property of given ages. It is intersubjective, not subjective. Conceiving of large-scale social outcomes as the aggregate of individual responses, these mechanisms, by my account, suffer from insufficient attention to the political context through which nations are constructed. Any satisfying account of the relationship between military institutions and nationhood must bring the politics of nation-building more than its psychology front and center. And so I think what we need to do is begin to recast this question in terms of the larger process of contention over the boundaries of nationhood. Now, sociologists have long noted, one way sociologists have tried to get at this, is that political communities, they say, regulate membership through citizenship, through the rules of citizenship. And I'm not interested here, just to preempt questions, not interested here in the formal rules of citizenship, but more importantly, in the effective rules of citizenship. To cast nationality as citizenship is inherently, I would argue, to bring politics to the fore. Very different, for those of you familiar with T.H. Marshall's classic account, in which there's very little contest, right? But think more of the ways in which people like Charles Tilly have written, in which citizenship reflects, as he writes, the historical accumulation of continual negotiation. It is the boundaries of effective citizenship that have been the sites of intense political contest. So who struggles for communal citizenship, for effective citizenship, should we pay most attention to? I would argue minorities. Minorities are the signposts of the nation. They are, by some accounts, liminal, both like and unlike, and consequently, this is where the greatest contests take place, and they're the ones that we need to pay attention to if we want to understand where and what are the frontiers of the nation. As minority groups plead for first-class citizenship, protest for equal treatment and equal rights, demand autonomy, and even, on occasion, rise up in rebellion, they necessarily give shape to the larger community with which they are in dialogue and with which their relationship is ambiguous and perhaps ambivalent. To interrogate the relationship between military and service and nation building is not to consider how the military experience might directly shape and reshape individuals' mental horizons. So to try to render the research question more concrete and more tractable, I would put it as follows. Under what conditions and how do the military's manpower policies shape the struggles of minorities for citizenship, that is, especially for first-class citizenship? And I'm going to talk about two mechanisms, one that is more culturalist and one that is more rationalist, but you'll quickly see that there are sort of elements of sort of strategic thinking and culture at the heart of both of these mechanisms. In order to actually think about this question, we have to begin by recognizing that militaries are not simply tools for achieving victory on the battlefield. That militaries are more than that, they are social institutions. They're sites of social and cultural power and contestation. more specifically military institutions and military service, have in the popular imagination long been linked with citizenship and nationhood. Machiavelli drew upon this link when he discovered in military virtu the highest form of civic virtue, in military discipline the training ground for the citizen attentive to the common good, and in the willingness and ability to bear arms the test of individual autonomy. Participation in the armed forces has, at least in the nation-state system since around the 18th century, been depicted as a sign of one's full membership in the political community, as well as evidence of one's worthiness for citizenship. The great German historian Otto Hintze, as he put it, whoever puts himself in the service of the state must logically and fairly be granted the regular rights of citizenship. This is a classic Western norm of citizenship, one that in the Israeli context is so much a part of the discourse that I don't think really needs. In the United States, we sometimes have to talk about it more, but not in Israel. Leaders of communal groups have understood this, and this is among the reasons that they have, time and again, contrasted discursively the reality of their entrenched political and social inequity to their people's unassailable record of loyalty and sacrifice. So strong has been their faith in the power of this norm that they have very often counseled strongly against draft evasion during times of war and even urged their followers to enlist. They've sought to invoke this widely recognized norm to raise consciousness among both their aggrieved and their oppressors, to draw attention to an imbalance in the equation of rights and obligations, and ultimately to trap leaders in their own rhetorical commitments. And in fact, among the reasons that state leaders have imposed discriminatory manpower policies and resisted liberalizing reforms in the military is precisely so as to gainsay and to forestall this kind of process, because they too have recognized the power of such rhetorical tropes. In the wake of war, minorities, as I've suggested, very often try to play on the just deserts of their military sacrifice. Those inside and outside government, equally eager to deny them their claims as they are themselves equally eager to have them accepted, engage in intense disputes over that performance under fire. And as they seek respectively to establish and to discredit the group's military record, they struggle to impose a meaning on the past, believing that it is critical to the political field of battle, not just the military field of battle. And so what they try to do is to deploy rhetoric, to frame, so as to twist tongues, because in the belief that twisting tongues will ultimately yield the twisting of arms, to get them to acknowledge the justice of their demands. They try to force debate onto a favorable rhetorical turf. And when they succeed in doing so, what you have is what I would call rhetorical coercion. And I'd be happy to talk about that more, what the significance is of in this. But in political science today, there's been a lot of attention to persuasion, but very little to rhetorical coercion. And I think that we need to think about rhetoric in coercive terms. Why is it that rhetorical coercion is possible? Rhetorical coercion is possible because of two key presumptions that I make about politics. Have to do with my sort of understanding of what it is that lies in the ontology of politics. One is that for me, politics is not just about, yes, it's about coercion and distribution, but politics is also about the creation of meaning. And ultimately, we are impelled to frame what it is that we are doing. The effort to forge shared meaning necessarily implicates some public audience in the process, and thus all parties continually strive to legitimate their positions in the eyes of the public. The second basic presupposition is that because of the public, rhetoric is not infinitely elastic. Speakers may not say just anything that they would like to say in the public arena, and that speaks to the question of the prevailing citizenship discourse and what are the nature of the rhetorical alternatives? What options do state leaders have at their disposal when minorities frame their citizenship claims in particular ways, in this case having to do with military service? In any particular bounded episode, the existing rhetorical arrays constitute, if you will, the boundary condition of political contest, forming the limits within cultural action occurs. Public semiotic codes, in other words, matter regardless of whether one truly believes in those codes' content. Rhetorical coercion then occurs, sort of at the end of this process, when one deprives one's opponents of the materials out of which to craft a publicly sustainable rebuttal, the bounds of what it is that the public would accept. Political actors are naturally free to say anything that they would like, but they run the risk of either not being understood or being punished for a breach of the rules of argumentation. So when is rhetorical coercion in this context most likely? It's most likely, one, when the public's a party to the claims making. If the public can, for a variety of reasons, be excluded, and we can talk about that, then effectively rhetorical coercion cannot occur. And secondly, it is going to matter when the universe of rhetorical commonplaces is at least somewhat constrained. And my view is that generally that rhetorical universes are never so narrow as to shut down political debate, but they are also not infinitely expansive. There are structural constraints. So when, regarding military service and its just rewards, when does this kind of rhetoric work? What is key there has to do with the nature of the prevailing citizenship discourse, which you might think of as being in ethno-national terms, as liberal terms, or in republican terms. When the political system is explicitly justified on the basis of inequity, you won't expect to see very much progress toward citizenship based upon military sacrifice. You also wouldn't expect to see much, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, when citizenship is based upon liberal grounds. That is, the holder of a status, whether it be a property owner in 18th century America, or whether it be in, say, the post-war United States and across much of the world, the understanding being that a citizen is one who is, someone is entitled to rights on the basis of the possession of a common humanity, right? Someone spoke about the UN Human Rights Convention. Rather, it is when guiding citizenship norms are republican that you'd expect this to be most effective. As political theorists have understood it, republicanism entails freedom from domination, as opposed to liberalism's freedom from interference. And unlike in liberalism, in republicanism, there's a great value in active participation in democratic politics, not because, as either in the Aristotelian positive liberty tradition or in the Rousseauian populist tradition, not because it's an end in itself, but rather because it fosters the public spiritedness that promotes a political culture hostile to domination and protective of liberty. So civic virtue in republicanism, in republican political cultures, is prized. When state authorities are bound to a republican citizenship discourse, wrapping one's rights claims in the bloody flag may leave the powers that be without an acceptable way to justify exclusionary policies. Faced with two unattractive options, either on the one hand broadening membership in the political community, or opening themselves to potential punishment, state elites may find the former, that is, opening the political community, to be the lesser of two evils. Right. Now, what about, we've got this first mechanism at the bottom. What about the second mechanism? This has more of a rationalist tone. And here the claim is that military service is critical because it may shape the politics of citizenship by influencing the timing, tactics, and the goals of minority political mobilization. The basic problem that relatively weak groups face is that rights are rarely granted without struggle with central authorities, and claims making, particularly when aggressive, may bring repression. As the minority considers its options, it has to decide whether to mobilize or whether to remain quiescent. And this decision is partly the product of what will be the state's likely response. In sort of formal language and game theoretic language, what is the state's type? Is it the type that will crush or this type that would respond openly? And the problem here is that if it's wrong, the consequences can be disastrous. And the problem is this is often private information, because states that are, for example, quiescent types may have incentives to act tough, and states that are actually tough types and may crush them may have a variety of incentives to actually pretend to be otherwise. Actors, however, in such circumstances are not without recourse, right? Because as all the game theoretic literature has suggested, strong signals can provide at least rickety bridges over these kinds of informational chasms. By revealing the actor's likely behavior in a variety of settings, such signals can reduce uncertainty and facilitate mutual cooperation. Because of their historical association with citizenship alluded to earlier, military manpower policies can serve as such a strong signal. So when is it that manpower policy signals are strong? Unfortunately, we have to sort of run through this because of some technical difficulties we had earlier. When is it that manpower policy signals are strong? Well, they're strong when they are credible, clear, and available. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. Again, I'm happy to elaborate. But the first hurdle over which any signal must jump is one of credibility. Actors of one type at times have incentives to pretend to be the opposite, and they consequently detect signals to design signals to yield that impression. And so credibility is a function of costliness, the likelihood of involuntary defection, in other words, the lower it is, the more credible it is, and reversibility. The less reversible, the more likely, the more credible the signal will be. And here you see sort of a number of dimensions, and I can run through the logic another time, where, for example, if minorities are perceived as more likely to defect, obviously including them in the military is going to be more costly, rendering the signal more credible. when the policy change originates with civilian leaders who have to overcome what is typically military opposition, the signal will often be more costly and hence more credible. When rates of leadership turnover in among the political elite are lower, there's a lesser likelihood of involuntary defection. When the state is more highly centralized, the same is true. When reforms occur during peacetime, they are less likely to be reversed. They tend to be stronger signals. And when the authorities' hands are tied by opposed interests, which is sort of what James Fearon has called tying hands signals as opposed to costly signals, when they're tied by opposed interests, then in fact reversibility is lower. However, strong signals also must exhibit clarity, by which I mean that credibility provides no guarantee that the signal and its meaning are apparent. And so manpower signaling is more clear when the state's more highly centralized, when the policy reform originates with civilians, and when the basis for military recruitment approaches universal service. And finally, signals also must be culturally available. Thomas Schelling, in Arms and Influence, a book I'm sure many of you have read at one time or another, has a very nice image. He asks, why is it when the Soviets, this is of course written in 1966, I believe, why is it when the Soviets and the United States are going toe-to-toe with each other, the U.S. doesn't simply kidnap the visiting Bolshoi ballet, right, in an attempt to actually influence the Soviets? And Schelling, of course, obviously says, well, this would be perceived as a violation of what is the norms of superpower negotiation. But of course, the implication is there may be circumstances in which you might in fact expect that kidnapping of ballerinas, in which the world is so tightly interconnected, that kidnapping ballerinas makes some sense. As Robert Jervis puts it, while behavior may reveal something important about the actor, often it is not clear exactly what is being revealed, what is intended to be revealed, and what others think will be revealed. And so, consequently, cultural availability matters. And here we come, when the prevailing citizenship discourse is Republican, when the surrounding society is relatively militaristic, and when the polity recently concluded fighting a major war, all of which I suggest render manpower policy signaling more inclusive. So what are the consequences of all this? And here, what I would sort of summarize these is that, drawing on Albert Hirschman's categories of exit, voice, and loyalty, that when manpower policy signals are inclusive, when you bring minorities into service, this generates a pattern of mobilization that I would call integrative voice. That is to say, where the timing of mobilization is relatively early, where the goal is for integration, and the tactics are conventional. They play by the general rules of the political game. However, when they're exclusive, when minorities eventually do mobilize, when they see chinks in the majority's discriminatory armor, they mobilize, but they mobilize relatively late. And when they do mobilize, they no longer mobilize for integration, but realizing that the society is not open to them, they in fact seek to generate autonomous, separate institutions that allow them to achieve their ends with as relatively little interaction from the larger society. And they adopt less conventional tactics, so they may adopt those as well, but they also embrace what others have called contentious politics. That is, politics that goes beyond the norm. And all of this has effects on both the degree of citizenship that is attained and when it's attained, and also the form of citizenship. It matters whether you are aiming for integration or separation as to what the nature of the citizenship might be. And again, I'm happy to elaborate on that. Obviously, there are two mechanisms here that we could talk about. I want to talk very briefly about what I think is in some ways more contentious, pardon, pun fully intended, about the power and limits of rhetorical coercion. And I think that some of this may be a bit controversial, but I'm just going to talk about this only in the most telegraphic style, as I think Ayal was the word Ayal used a little bit earlier. There are some quasi-successes, and you'll see why they're quasi in a moment. For my money, as I understand it, the Druze in Republican Israel constitute for me a quasi-success. That to the extent that Israel's Druze population has succeeded in wringing concessions from the Israeli body politic, from Jewish politicians, they have done so largely because that the nature of Republican citizenship discourse, combined with the nature of Druze claims-making, based on military service and citizenship, of shaveh chovot, shaveh zchuyot, the equality of, that slogan of equality of obligations yields equality of rights, and I'm glad I saw some heads already shaking, that's a good thing. Republican escape hatch. You don't serve in the military, consequently you are not deserving of rights. That opportunity, remember we spoke about the availability, what kind of opportunities are there to seek to deny claims, that is sustainable within the terms of Israel's Republican citizenship discourse. African Americans, U.S. women, and the vote during and after World War I is another quasi-success, and only quasi because the vote doesn't actually get them nearly as far as they thought. As I said, Christian, Muslim, Arabs, not as successful. African Americans after World War I represent another interesting contrast to, for example, to women, for example. African Americans served willingly in World War I in large numbers. They fought to get into the U.S. armed forces. But their efforts to invoke their loyal sacrifice came to naught, despite, and this is important, the prevalence of Republican citizenship talk in the United States, both before and after World War I through the early 1930s. Popular racism predisposed whites to belittle blacks' battlefield accomplishments and to credit allegations of black incompetence and cowardice. But there are also barriers to rhetorical coercion. One is the difficulty of simply compelling any kind of response. Even the most incontrovertible argument will have little impact when authorities need not respond. Now, Druze have surmounted this hurdle by a relatively sympathetic Hebrew language press, at least in my narrative of this. African Americans overcame this problem after World War II because their conventional political resources were actually quite substantial after World War II, thanks to the Great Migration. A contrast to this, of course, would be African Americans after World War I, who, no matter that they framed their appeals in Republican terms, African Americans lacked those conventional resources to dictate a hearing. Secondly, when the rhetorical constraints are insufficient, when the discourse is relatively open, right, it's often, there are sometimes options with which to rebuff the minority's claims. I suggested this already with regard to Christians and Muslims, that Jewish politicians had this at their disposal. After World War II, Southern politicians, of course, could justify discrimination against African Americans by resorting to language that was either overtly racist or by alleging that civil rights organizations were communist fronts, which they very often did. Conservative politicians like Eisenhower, although really pushed civil rights on the federal level, Eisenhower also adopted the language of states' rights fully within the terms of liberal political discourse. Decentralized political systems. It's a lot easier when you have a centralized political system to actually make some headway than when you have a decentralized political system. That was an advantage for the Druze compared to African Americans with the more federal American system. And finally, it's one thing to command rhetorical assent. It's another thing to actually get a bureaucracy to move. Right? And that has been the experience of both Druze and African Americans, that getting policymakers to agree in principle is different. Let me just conclude with a couple of implications. One is that this is a way of talking about the military as an institution but not as an actor. Much civil military relations is interested in the military as an actor. Is the military going to intervene? How assertive is it going to be in the political process? Trying to get us to think about militaries more as institutions. Secondly, what are the implications for militaries in democratic transition and consolidation? The civil military relations literature normally suggests these are terrible things. But of course, in his seminal article, Doncourt Rostow suggested that, of course, in order to have a successful democratic transition and consolidation, what you also need is to ensure that everyone sees themselves as being part of the same political community. To the extent that militaries may play a role in shaping how political communities, the shape of political communities, they may play actually a more salutary, more positive role in democratic transition and consolidation than some believe. Thirdly, at least in the United States, I don't know whether this is actually an active part of the debate in Israel, there is a very active debate over the nature of citizenship. I know it's part of the European debate as well, about between communitarians and their critics. Now, communitarians and Republicans are not identical, but they share a distaste for the atomistic world of liberalism, an aspiration for a true community marked by solidarity and belonging. On one hand, I'm sympathetic to their argument that a renewed emphasis on civic duty and public service might reinvigorate democracy, American democracy in particular. But this larger project also raises questions about communitarianism and the civic republican project. Because republicanism has, in practice, if not in theory, often had a dark side. Political theorists will suggest that republicanism is more or less compatible with a whole range of goods, as they're sort of conventionally understood, at least on the left, right? Feminist, socialist, even multiculturalist agendas. Some would suggest are all more or less that republicanism can be married to that it is sort of neutral with regard to those questions. But they failed, it seems to me, adequately to confront the tension between theory and practice and to come to grips with republicanism's unsavory history. Because both in the United States and in Israel and in many, many other countries, Republican citizenship discourse created opportunities for some groups at the margins, but it also silenced many others. Arabs, for a long time, white American women, and African Americans. What are the remaining questions? One, how portable is this model across space and time? It's a very deeply contextualized model. Obviously, I haven't been able to explore every country, though we would like to be able to. Much more empirical work, it seems to me, remains to be done until we can say with a great deal of confidence of how broadly and widely these mechanisms operate. Secondly, are there other state institutions that might, in fact, serve the same function in shaping minority political activity? The differences in institutional features and cultural location between militias and uniformed militaries, between fire or police departments and militaries, between civil service and military service, merit, it seems to me, serious reflection and examination. And finally, are there other ways that minorities can go about demonstrating civic virtue and laying the foundation for potent citizenship claims? Can volunteers lay claim to civic virtue more or less effectively than can conscripts? Civic virtue is a cultural construction, a shared understanding that, at least in Republican polities, is often the subject of intense contestation. What precisely serves in any context as evidence of civic virtue must be negotiated, and it is, therefore, historically contingent. A fuller understanding of the politics of sacrifice requires grasping the shifting meaning of civic virtue and the place of military service in that complex. I thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your skeptical questions.
It seems to me that your analysis is very important as far as citizenship is concerned. I have great doubts about the applicability of your analysis to nationalism, and you indeed didn't talk about nationalism. Take, for instance, the Druses here, which you said that it's a semi-success. They are totally ethnically different than the Jews in Israel, and they are not part of the Jewish nation or the Jewish. And then I can go on and on talk about some minorities in Australia, for instance, the Greeks in Australia. They serve in the military and they have full citizenship and they participate. But you know that I meet some of the Greek members of parliament in Australia, you know where? In Greece. Involved in Greek affairs and so on and so forth. And when you talk to the Greeks in Australia, they didn't lose their ethno-national, background. So I suggest that we should think about this distinction. And I can go on, Ron, on and mention, many ethnic minorities who serve in the military and who have full citizenship, and they did lose their ethnic background and ethnic identity.
Partly it's because you're operating with a very different understanding of what is national identity. In other words, the way you understand, let me infer and put words in your mouth. It's my privilege as being the speaker at the moment. As the way I understand, the way you're understanding national identity, right, is this becomes this identity that crowds out all others. For the way I understand, a distinct difference between Ernest Gellner defines nationalism, as you will know, as a political principle. That nationalism is a political principle in which you would like the ethnicity, the ethnic group, to have self-determination. That is rather different. In other words, we can have the United States is full of ethnic Americans, right? Some of them we discussed last night, right? Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Albanian Americans have in a variety of ways participated, especially in the Irish and Albanian cases, participated in their own countries' national liberation struggles. Does that render them less American? Can they have identities that are activated equally strongly in different ways? I would suggest that that's not the case. There is a reason, now partly, and so consequently, Israel is, however, I think a different question still. Right? And this has to do partly, this relates to the larger themes of the conference, right? Is Israel, about the extent to which Israel is comparable or not? Do we have in Israel the notion of a distinct Israeli identity that is, to some extent at least, separable of Jewish identity? Or is, now of course my understanding is that in public opinion surveys, for example, this declined dramatically in '67. That the 67 war was a watershed moment that made Israel more Jewish, shall we say, and less Israeli. And one thing that's quite revealing to me, though, is that when public opinion polls are conducted among Druze and other Arabs, it is revealing that Druze are far more likely to accept the mantle, even since the late 70s, right, when things started heating up in the Arab community. The Druze, more than other Arabs, are far more interested in accepting the label of Israeli. That number has been declining over the course of the last 25 years, but it's still far higher than in the rest of the Arab community. But more broadly, I mean, it raises a very interesting question about the nature of Israeli identity, which I don't know if we want to get into here, but whether Israel, but it raises the question about the extent to which Israel is a normal nation, right, in which there is a distinct national identity separate of the variety of ethnicities that may continue to make up the national political community.
Forget about Israel. Think about Australia.
I'm afraid I don't know much about the Australian case, so I'll have to take your word for that.
Yeah.
Clarification question. Ron, thank you very much for your great presentation. One, could you just again clarify the difference between persuasion and rhetorical coercion?
Sure.
And the second question, in your presentation, the book may be very different. You seem to assume an equivalence between racial identity, gender identity, ethnic identity, and national identity. Do these different identities, and I know everything is fluid and so on, do they work differently? In the sense that ethnic groups do have a certain an assumption about political representation or expression that maybe women's groups do not.
Those are both. Let me deal with the first clarification first, and then I'll talk about the other one. The clarification here is that persuasion in generally involves changing basic preferences. That when someone is persuaded, their basic, what someone calls their preferences over outcomes, are shaped. Coercion involves not shaping their basic, if you're willing to use the language, utility curves, right? But it involves shaping the degree of choice, right? So when constraints are placed on choice, as I understand it, I'm drawing here from David Baldwin's wonderful work on statecraft, that is when there was already a form of coercion. How do deterrence and compellence work, to take this more into the international realm? Deterrence and compellence work by constraining choice, and we call those, in fact, classic forms of coercion. It is in fact very odd. Political psychologists, for example, use the word persuasion to mean any and all kind of change, an attitudinal change. So that, for example, nuclear deterrence is considered to be an example of persuasion, which is bizarre to anyone who studied international relations, where this is in fact a classic instance of coercion. So what I in fact mean by rhetorical coercion is the ways in which rhetoric is used to shape the boundaries of acceptable response and to impose constraints on what others may say then in response. Right? Without necessarily, even though you might aspire to shape what it is that they ultimately desire, the Druze may very well have wished to have Jewish decision makers want to welcome them with open arms into the Israeli body politic. But I think at the same time they understood that that was A, pretty unlikely, and B, that they could still achieve their political goals even if they were not able to do so. With regard to the other question, that's a very interesting one that I actually have to confess in all the talks I've given on this and everything else, no one has actually posed the question in precisely that way.
Start talking to anthropologists.
Yeah, this is why we need interdisciplinary conversation. Right? I spend too much time with political scientists. And it's a very interesting question. You're right, I do treat them as being more or less equivalent. Maybe I should not, when I look at the discourse surrounding, say, the only case regarding gender that I feel that I know reasonably well, which is the case of the suffragist movement in both England, France, and the United States, there is a distinct attempt to represent women's issues qua women's issues. The women wish to be represented as women, and that's why ultimately it's a quasi-success, right? Because what they end up discovering is that they're not what ends up happening is that women vote the way their husbands or their parents vote, right? Or they, for a variety of political influences, but they don't vote purely on the basis of being women. So you don't have the formation of women's political parties, at least, but of course in Israel you have all kinds of small groups, right? What was the Pensioners' Party in the last election that actually won a surprising number of votes? So you can have all kinds of coalitions. In many countries it has not surrounded gender, but the suffragists certainly expected that it would, and that's why they put so much faith in the vote, and believed ultimately that that would lead to their integration into the larger political economy, which did not happen, of course, in the immediate wake of the vote. But that's a really important question that, I think bears some further consideration.
So now I have two questions. I had only one, but since you start talking,
the more the merrier.
Yes. Regarding the Druze, it's not really a question. I think it's sort of a comment. Why you regard it as a semi-success, and I think it's more of a failure. And that is because the Republican discourse never works on its own. It's always within the context of ethno-national discourse. That you can be a good Republican citizen, because it's a citizen that contributes to a community, only within the boundaries of the ethno-national community. And they will never be part of the ethno-national community in Jewish Israel. And therefore they are second-class citizens even though they serve in the army. So quasi-success, I would say quasi-failure. If you go to the villages and you see how they live, there's not much difference between them and the Muslims in Israel. If you think about the education system, about the welfare services, about infrastructure, electricity, water, there's not much difference between them and the Arab villages. If you go into a village that has both Muslims and Druze, their level of living is somewhat higher, not much. Not a big difference. It's a good, if you're here already, it's a good exercise. You go to Rab and see both neighborhoods, not much of a difference. And a good example will be the Haredim group who do not serve in the army and do get all the rights because they belong to the ethno-national discourse and not at all to the Republican discourse, even though they say that they contribute through studying it, preserving the religion, etc., but not according to the Republican discourse. And regarding women, the suffragist movement is not a very good example. It's not similar to the military in any way because the military judges people according to their masculinity. And they definitely judge men according to their level of masculinity and absolutely judge women according to the level of being able to stand up to masculine standards. Therefore, the citizenship that is gained through military service is always gained according to a male standard. Carol Pateman said it long before I did. Cynthia Endo said it long before I did, and many more names. And therefore, trying to achieve citizenship through military service is very different from male. And very different, trying to achieve the vote is very different from trying to achieve citizenship through military service.
2 points. I'll the second one first. I was not seeking to argue by the example of women that much of what you say is true. There may be ways in which this is changing. I mean, I would have said prior to Iraq, I might very well have said that, in fact, one of the shifting norms in the American military is that, in fact, women were increasingly participating in effective combat, right? Because in all these peacekeeping missions, women were participating, and this was becoming the functional equivalent of combat and the way in which one actually made one's way up the chain of command and getting promotions in the U.S. military. Things are different now, obviously, in the context of an actual major military campaign like Iraq. What I was seeking to argue is that for example, after World War I, and this is only in this context, both in England and in the United States, women made arguments on the basis of their contributions to the common good. And particularly their contributions to the war effort, even out of uniform. And Woodrow Wilson and British leaders, for them, this was all a critical part of the discourse, in which they didn't feel that they could actually that they had a sustainable rebuttal. So I meant it only in that narrow sense. Everything that you say on that sense is absolutely right. The argument about the Druze, of course, there is an ethno-national discourse in Israel, although very often it's actually sort of sotto voce, right? That it's very often sort of not as much publicly articulated. You have phrases like the Jewish state, right? But for example, you will rarely have an Israeli leader say to even in the period before the Arab vote was perceived as mattering very much and perceived as being up for grabs, so prior to the early 80s, you rarely see a Jewish politician going and saying, we don't give you, equal rights because you just, because you're an Arab and you're a second-class citizen in the Jewish state.
Just had
Citizenship law.
Citizenship law just now that did exactly that. Saying that Arabs can't marry Arabs in the territories and get Israeli citizenship. It did just that.
Well, that's a different matter. I mean, it's not clear to me that that's equivalent. But what I want to point out is that, Yoav Peled wrote this very nice article on ethno, and of course, he and Gershom Shafir have their book on ethno-republican. Now, the one thing I think that's very insightful and very important. However, what they are not sensitive to are the ways in which these multiple discourses of Israeli citizenship that they talk about remember, again, they portray this as essentially a cohesive whole. Discourses are not cohesive wholes. Discourses, in fact, often have contradictions embedded in them. And it seems to me that, in fact, the turn to what is a very often ethnic-free Republican discourse is in tension very often. The Druze sit very much at the nexus of and in tension with that ethno-national discourse, and they have successfully exploited that contribution. Will they ever be first-class citizens? Well, I don't know about the future. Clearly, they have not achieved first-class citizenship. I have I don't want to sort of cite all the data now, but there are certainly ways in which I would not completely agree with your characterization, that in fact what they've done is achieve movement toward, and that's why I call it a quasi-success, movement toward first-class citizenship, and in which they have often occupied, if you look at sort of levels of income, not educational levels, but levels of income, for example, and, by the way, throughout in the 1970s, and then again, by the way, in the 1990s, received far higher levels of government grants. Right now, it may be that you might look at the towns and say that these are the villages, and then say that you don't see any difference. But in terms of the more objective measures that we have, they seem to have actually adopted some kind of intermediate status. I'm not making a claim that they've attained first-class citizenship. What I'm making the claim is that they have achieved movement in that direction that, again, historically speaking, not today, but historically speaking, they moved earlier than did other Arabs. Now, in terms of the degree, right, one of the things that late movers, as we know for Alexander Gerschenkron and even other studies of late mobilizers, they have one distinct advantage, which is they learn from those who came before them. And so that allows them to catch up sometimes relatively quickly. It is even, frankly, surprising by most of our standard accounts of politics, say, who gets what, when, where, and how, is who's got the money, right? Who has the money, who has the votes, who has the numbers. By almost all these accounts, we would have expected the Druze to have mobilized later, to have achieved less, not equality, right? And I could frame it, though I don't frame it, so I could even frame if you told me that their villages are more or less equal, I would say that's even surprising from the perspective of most of our basic theories of politics, right? I think that they've actually done a little bit, they've done better than that and occupy something like an intermediate level, but I can only say, encourage you to buy the book. So that's trying to increase my royalty check.
One last question very, very briefly.
Okay. I think your theoretical claims are very interesting, but don't take Israel as an example. It's a bad example for everything. And if you look at the Jews,
Israeli exceptionalism, the voice thereof. Wonderful.
No, because I think that if you hear, I'm going back to the Jews, you hear what they say. Their claim is exactly, we serve the army, but we get exactly as the Muslim Arabs. This is their claim. Because they don't feel that they do what, like, they serve as the Jews do, but they don't get anything back. So I think your theoretical claim is very good, but you shouldn't take Israel as an example. Second thing I want to say briefly, a distinction. I think you should make a distinction between what minorities think that they can get from serving in the army, maybe what the state wants them to believe that they will get from serving in the army, and what they eventually get. I don't think they get anything, or I can't say generally, but a lot of times they don't get anything, but they want to believe that they will get something, and the state wants them to believe that serving in its army will get them somewhere else, but eventually nothing happens.
On the second point, you are 2/3 of the way exactly right. In other words, what minorities think that they're going to achieve and what the state often wants, so again, look at the Israeli case, right, of course, are radically different. What I'm trying to suggest here is that, in fact, nevertheless, that precisely because of that there are unintended consequences here, right, that states are not quite as hegemonic, and that there are then processes set in place that actually have consequences that they cannot fully control, including consequences regarding citizenship. But in terms of that, whether that minorities think they can get something and that states think something else, you're absolutely right. And it is precisely, of course, minorities' efforts to exploit that, and sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. And what this project tries to do is, in fact, explain when they are more or less likely to be successful. So trying to explain variation in what you would, the third of your triptych, which is what they actually get, I would argue that there's some variation in that. With regard to whether the Druze are, I'm sorry, what's your name? Yuval. With regard to whether the Druze are a good case, Israel's a good case or a bad case, I think maybe we should just sort of, I'll be happy to talk about that. Happy to talk about that afterwards. I think that this is one of, it's quite interesting. I mean, I tend to get, actually, I did have a number of people who are fairly distinguished scholars, like Joel Migdal and others read this, and it was just curious to get their response. And of course, the responses tended to be bimodal. Either people tended to think this was entirely right, or they tended to think it was entirely wrong, which is not exactly atypical from the perspective of Middle Eastern studies, so, and particularly the scholarship on Israel. So I think we'll just have to talk further, and I can only say that perhaps at the end we'll have to agree to disagree. But I would like to think that Israel is not generally, I mean, speaking sort of more broadly in terms of the themes of this conference, I mean, just to be about the is Israel comparable or is Israel more or less exceptional? Right? And I think it's one of the things that you would like to raise. From my perspective, you might conceivably argue that Israel is sort of an extreme case. but I would like to think that we can place Israel along a continuum of comparability.
It's exceptionally comparable.
There you are.
Okay, thank you very much. Our fourth speaker is Stuart Cohen, Professor of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University, where he's also a senior fellow of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, BESA. His research interests are Zionist history, the development of the Jewish political tradition, politics and strategy in the 20th century, and societal military relations in Israel. And he's presently working on a book-length study of traditional and modern Jewish attitudes towards the use of military force. In 2000, he's edited Democratic Societies and Their Armed Forces, Israel in Comparative Context. This is sort of our subject here. Okay, so can you start without the...
well, meanwhile, I'll tell you something about... God. About God, yeah. When I was well, as you know, every Sabbath, Jews throughout the world who go to synagogue, they read from the portion of the law. And usually there are 7 people who are called to each weekly portion. Males, only males. Well, when I was a young kid, my father occasionally used to take me to his synagogue, which was a very small steeple, small synagogue. And there they had the very uncomfortable habit of not calling 7 people, but calling virtually everybody in the room, all males. And when they finally came to the last, and the warden would say, come up so-and-so and so-and-so, the last, then all the young people sitting in the back, myself included, would let out a very indecorous, ironic cheer. Well, I'm the last here on this panel, and you've been a much better audience than we as young boys were, and so you don't let out an ironic cheer, but I would appreciate very much the help of the... oh, there we go. There we are, the man's arrived. Thank you. Anyway, so that's the position I'm in. I'm the last, and that's the side. As we heard, actually, I will have something to say about a couple of the presentations in this panel, and I'll start with Samy, because as Samy pointed out, fears have been expressed that with the increase in national religious troops in IDF combat units, that some form of coup d'etat, military coup, with the support of rabbis, perhaps encouraged by rabbis, would become more probable. And these fears were expressed in quite a serious form after the Rabin assassination in 1995. And with the program Disengagement, they seem to become more vociferous. Especially was this so when, towards Disengagement, a very venerable rabbi, Rabbi Shapira, former chief rabbi of Israel, head of one of the principal academies, Yeshivot, issued a public call on, for all troops, but especially, of course, national religious troops, to refuse to obey any orders to take part in disengagement. And leaflets were handed round in their thousands to troops, encouraging them to follow this advice. And from time to time, as time went on and disengagement came closer and closer, various estimates, wild estimates, were bandied around about the number of servicemen and women, whether they be regulars or conscripts, perhaps even people on professional service, who might follow this instruction or encouragement, exhortation, and tens of thousands and all sorts of figures were banned. In fact, in the morning of the disengagement itself, the military correspondent of the Ma'ariv newspaper, which is a very popular newspaper, a man called Amir Oren, published an article in which he said, this is an existential test for the IDF. Will the IDF manage to, in fact, preserve its unity in the face of it? Well, in the event, what happened was, of course, nothing, it was all just a bubble. And we have the figures of IDF troops placed on trial for refusing to obey orders relevant to disengagement. And according to the evidence which the Chief of General Staff gave to the Knesset Committee a month after disengagement, we're talking about, 63 people placed on trial, of whom 24 of the 50th conscripts, 24 belonged to one of these frameworks which was most feared, Hesder framework, in which troops combine their military service with study in yeshiva, and which places them really under a system of dual control, if you like, a system which gives great authority to rabbis in the over troops who are serving. Now, I'm sure that's an underestimate, because we know from other sources that larger numbers, much larger numbers of troops, had in fact come to private arrangements with their individual commanders, asking not to be placed in what they would consider to be compromising situations. We also know that before disengagement took place, there were a number of incidents in which some soldiers did, in fact, announce that they would refuse and had to be moved. I mean, that isn't the sum total. But nevertheless, we're not talking about tens of thousands, and certainly en masse. National religious troops, men or women, national religious troops did not refuse to obey orders to participate in disengagement, despite all the fears and despite all the exhortations and despite all the publicity. And the question is, why not? Why did they not? And I would suggest that we have to, in order to find some sort of answer, we have to address three contexts. One is institutional military, two I call the theological, the terms are not exactly, and the third I'd like to call sociological. And what I'd like to do very briefly is to go through each of three and suggest the relevance of each, and each are relevant. I mean, I don't think you can find an answer without. It's really a historical. The institutional military context. What I mean by this is the steps taken by the IDF in anticipation of disengagement, and in order to minimize or in order to moderate the possible incidents of conscientious objection or refusal to obey orders. And I think that the IDF really deserves full credit because despite the fact that, as somebody mentioned before, despite the fact that the Chief of Staff, when disengagement was first introduced, despite the fact that he was opposed to disengagement, nevertheless he seems to have really invested an enormous amount of energy in preparing the force for disengagement, and I think did so very successfully. By any standards, I think this was really a very successful operation on the part of the IDF, one of the very few, actually, operational successes the IDF has had in recent years, in the sense that there was very little turbulence, and it was carried out without any bloodshed whatsoever, which is really a considerable achievement. And I think that the measures taken on massive deployment, I mean, really, just the sheer impression of numbers, I think, was overwhelming. Disengagement was treated as a constabulary mission from the very start. No weapons. Training and preparation, especially on the part of the education branch and also by the psychological or psychologists who were attached to the behavioral science unit, which was already mentioned today. I myself have just, and I'm sure there's more, I've got 2 video tapes, 2 CDs, 11 printed pamphlets, 33 other forms of publication, which I've just managed to collect, which are prepared by these units in preparation for disengagement. And from conversations with troops who took part, it's clear that they were subjected to a barrage of day-long seminars and lectures, and also, I mean, they really thought that it was really, coming out of their ears by the time that they finished. But it was clear that this was very, very important and taken very seriously, and I think it had a certainly great effect. With regard to religious troops themselves, the specific target, I think here too, preparations and the efforts, measures taken by the IDF were extremely well thought out. Combination of carrot and stick. The stick being, of course, warnings that were there to be any conscientious objection, that the military would come down very hard. And the carrot being, of course, that some form of modus vivendi could be found. So, for instance, all troops were instructed to wear hats, so you wouldn't be able to distinguish between those who did have a kippah and those who didn't have a kippah. For instance, that many of the troops who had relatives or families who lived, in fact, within the settlements about to be dismantled could be excused. could be excused. And this also, I think, was a character which was very much appreciated. So I think that there you have one context which explains why there was no disengagement. Of course, what's missing from here, and you would have mentioned it, I'm sure if I wasn't going to do so now, is that what's missing from here is the chief rabbinate, the army chief rabbinate. And absent from the scene, if you like, of preparing the troops, and especially national religious troops, for what was thought going to be a traumatic experience, was the chief rabbinate. And the chief rabbinate really was very much in the background of its own choice, of the then military chief chaplain's own choice, a man called Weiss, who is no longer actually a military chief chaplain. He's going to be replaced. And he was very much in a quandary as to whether he should, whether he shouldn't. He was a pupil himself of this Rabbi Shapira, and he found himself in a very difficult situation, kept himself in the background, and really played no part whatsoever. What happened as a result, partly as a result of that, and here moving on now to the second of my context, the theological context, what happened as a result of that was the absence of the chief of the military rabbinate, in fact, left the field free for non-military rabbinate to, in fact, now give instruction to troops as to what was going to happen. Now, the important thing here is that the most important word in this entire thing is debate. That there was not just one opinion. There was more than one opinion. Very much more than one opinion. Of which Rabbi Shapira's calling for outright refusal to participate was one, and of which various other voices, ranging from, along the spectrum, ranging from outright refusal to even consider any form of conscientious rejection, to various shades of conscientious objection, along the spectrum, all expressed by rabbinic figures, many of whom were also teachers in or principals of these Yeshivot Hesder or the Mechinot, the pre-military conscription colleges, which are also fairly popular amongst the national religious community. And the characteristics of that debate is that, first, it was very intense. It wasn't just one against one. We've got manifestos signed by 57 on one opinion, 63 on another opinion. I mean, the numbers really are quite large. Second of all, it was highly public. These manifestos were published, both in the national press and in various pamphlets that are issued throughout synagogues and distributed throughout the national religious community in through various networks. So that the expulsion, Gerush, as it was termed, the expulsion became really a matter of public discourse, not just a question of an inner discussion. Third, the arguments were well rehearsed. In fact, there was very little that was said that was new from a theological point of view, for or against conscientious objection. Aryeh Nor has written a book about which really spells out the arguments for and against, issued for and against conscientious objection, which are issued as early as Yamit, which is 1982, and then were rehearsed at the time of Oslo in 1993. And the arguments virtually repeated themselves in the year 2004, 2005. The issues are very clear. On the one, first of all, question of perceived national priorities, the sanctity of the land, the wholeness of the land, against, vis-a-vis, set aside against the preservation of life, pikuach nefesh, which is a meta-halachic concept, which tends to override everything. Of course, that's open to two interpretations, because there were people who said that by relinquishing the Gaza Strip, you were more endangering life than you were by holding on to the Gaza Strip. So you can interpret it, but nevertheless, it was a concept which was state sovereignty, the idea of mamlachtiyut, the idea that a Jewish state is in fact something which has its own halachic, rabbinic force, and of course the concept of Jewish unity. If the Second Temple was destroyed because of internecine strife, then we've got to be careful of this, otherwise the Third Commonwealth will also be destroyed. And in the background there's the whole issue of the scope of rabbinic authority. Do rabbis in fact have the right, duty, obligation to in fact decide upon matters which are not really within traditional jurisdiction? After all, rabbis don't decide whether people should or should not fast on the Day of Atonement and Yom Kippur. They delegate this authority to medical authorities, and perhaps we should do the same with regard to this, or perhaps we should not. And here, but these issues are not new. I mean, these were debated, as I said, over 10, 15 years, and there's a lot to be said, and certainly I'm the last to decide. There's a lot to be said on both sides. Well, why, in fact, then, was one argument preferred over the other? Why, if there are two arguments, or at least two sides to this question, one stressing the sanctity of the Holy Land, the unity of the, and the other stressing something else, then why, in fact, did most troops seem to prefer one argument to the other? And I think here, in order to find the answer to that, we have to turn thirdly to the sociological, what I call the sociological context. And I start off with something which was pointed out by Captain Hadasminka Brand.
She's now a major.
She's now a major, right. So I'm pleased to hear that. Now I will immediately, right, make efforts to correct this. I'm sorry. But when I read the article she wrote a very, very informative article in the journal put out by the Behavioural Sciences Unit, in which she was attached to the Golani Brigade, where there's a high percentage of national religious troops. And she was involved in part of this psychological preparation. She goes and explains, and a lot of what I know comes from this article. And she points out there's something very interesting called the imitation effect. What she points out is that many of the officers, junior officers, in this Golani Brigade also wear the kippas through. Now, junior officers, they're professional troops. They're the least likely to refuse to obey orders, basically because they're professional military people. Because they didn't disobey orders, because they, from the very beginning, in the overwhelming majority, she points out one exception, the overwhelming majority showed an absolute determination to carry out orders, then this had a knock-on effect on the conscripts, who perhaps might have been wavering, but then they saw their junior officers and they said, well, if they're going to do it, then we're going to do it. Which, of course, is very significant because if one of the fears originally expressed, which Samy referred to, which I referred to at the beginning, was that because of the high rate of national religious officers in the IDF, then the threat of some form of action directed by military would be stronger. Well, then, of course, this turns the whole thing on its head. In fact, people who are afraid of some form of religious intervention in military affairs should encourage religious people to become junior officers because they will have a moderating effect. That is one of the lessons you could... Well, certainly she doesn't draw that lesson. I mean, she doesn't go that far, but she certainly points out. Second point, I think, to point out, that's, again, sociological, is I said there were 57 here and 63 there and 94. I mean, the numbers are really irrelevant, but what's more important is the comparative celebrity of the protagonists. Now, this Rabbi Shapir, of course, is a cult figure. He's a law unto himself. But if you take below that, the standard below that, many of the figures in the debate who expressed themselves on behalf of conscientious objection were, quite frankly, not as celebrities, perhaps an unfortunate word, but not as well-known figures in the national religious community amongst this particular segment of young adults, as were many of the people who spoke against Rabbis Lichtenstein, Sherlow, Bin Nun, and I can go on down, Blumenthal, I can go on down the list. That's not to say they're they're greater authorities. I don't know whether they're greater authorities, but they're less well-known. Or at least the people who spoke against were more well-known, and I think this also perhaps had an effect. But I think the third factor, and this is one which I'd really like to emphasise, and which I'll spend a couple of minutes on, is the relevance or irrelevance, you can weigh it, I think it has to be examined, of disengagement to the various constituencies that comprise the National Religious Service segment. And here I have to say a few words. One is, first of all, that when we talk about the National Religious Service, we're not talking about a homogeneous unit of sociological analysis. That this community, perhaps contrary to the stereotype, but this community, like many other communities, is made up of various parts. And the community for very many years now, I'm going 10, 12 years, has been undergoing a process of polarization, of atomization, between what one would call still mainstream national religious there's a post-Zionist national religious tendency. And there's post-modern national religious tendency. Post-Zionist religious tendency might say, in fact it does say, that in fact the Zionist state, the Jewish state, if you like, the Jewish state is not what we wanted it to be, and therefore perhaps we have to disassociate ourselves from many of the institutions of the Jewish state, including the school system, including the military. The postmodern national religions would say, well, perhaps we've taken a wrong turn in concentrating so much on national affairs, territorial affairs, and what we really have to do is spend much more time investigating new issues which we've neglected in the past, such as society, ecology, health, equality. And that I call postmodern. And the split is very between these two groups, and there are others, and there are splinters and splinters upon splinters. And I think we're not talking about one community. And so you have to argue and now look at what place does the issue, or what place did the issue of disengagement play in this spectrum of issues, which is occupying the minds and hearts and souls of these various elements that comprise the national religious service segment. Well, the problem, of course, is to find evidence. How would I know? You can interview, and so you do interview, but you're never going to interview everybody. I think that we do have an instrument which is remarkable, because it does allow us a window into what young servicemen especially are thinking. And that is responsa. Questions that young people on military service or about to do military service write to their rabbis. The questions are much more interesting than the answers, by the way, I'll tell you. Which is, I mean, it's clear. Many of these are on the internet, and the internet is a source. Many of these are published. This is new. For many years, the Israeli rabbinate, the military rabbinate, the IDF rabbinate, saw itself as really answering questions. It used to publish a journal. I just took out one because this is from Chag HaShavuot, which was just a couple of days ago. So I just took out one. And it used to publish. That journal no longer exists. Because they're not asking the military rabbis. They're asking civilian rabbis. And what we have now is published volumes of responsa. It begins with Shlomo Goren, the big figure, who was, of course, the first and greatest of Israeli military rabbis, the first chief chaplain for many years, and then afterwards, of course, became chief. And then afterwards, he published the book called Meshiv Milchama, in which he has many of his responses. But now look at but that's just one. But now we've got a whole library. And look at the names. Melumadei Milchama, Kishrei Milchama, Michael El Chayim. Reshut Rabim, that's by Rabbi Sherlock, which is a play, of course. Shut, right? Reshut Rabim. It's questions on the internet, many of which have military. There are books written about how to behave in a military context. Hatzava Ka'alacha, Hilchot Tzava, which is a pocket book, which is issued so that the soldiers can put it in their trouser pocket or their shirt pocket. Arachim Mivcham Milchama, and so on and so forth. I think if you go to this source, what you find there is something quite remarkable. Implication will take me 1 more minute. All right, in the interest of time, I'll just tell you the summary. What you find there is, in fact, that disengagement was not at all then, and if you look over the long span of 10, 12 years, has never been the principal concern of these people. In fact, it's been a minority concern. Now, it does rise somewhat, obviously, as you get towards disengagement, if you do a statistical count. What they're mainly interested in is, first of all, technical things. How to behave, how to keep the Sabbath under military circumstances. That's number one. Second of all, what they're interested in is the preservation of their identity. Gender integration being an example, which has presented an enormous challenge to both men and women. from these segments, religious community. How do you deal with non-religious soldiers? You took the example of the Druze. Supposing a Druze is cooking for me. Well, according to halakha, I can't eat. But obviously, if I'm going to live with this man and we're going to serve together, well, how am I going to deal? Am I going to throw the food back in his face? How should I deal with it? These are really what issues. How do I deal with rabbinic authority? How do I deal with the military authority? These are the issues which are really of concern. If you go, that's what they're saying in the response to literature. And I think that's why they didn't take the path of conscientious objection. Because quite frankly, they didn't care that much. So what are the implications? Well, I'll be careful here. First of all, despite what I just said, the pundits were right in saying that there's a problem here with national... They are right, but for the wrong reasons. For many national... Again, you can't talk in... For many national religious soldiers, service is contingent. It certainly is contingent, but it's not on the retention of settlements. I mean, that's really not going to be the... But on the ability to maintain and develop their own lifestyle. That's what it's contingent on.
Settlements are part of the lifestyle.
And what?
But the settlements are part of the lifestyle.
Well, I don't think that they all see that as such. That is not the evidence that I have, anyway. And the second implication, which relates more to what Ron was saying earlier about, is the IDF. I don't think you can see the IDF as a tool of social engineering. Looked at from this perspective as a people's army. Rather, I prefer to use the phrase that's been used by Yogi Levy, Eyal Ben-Ari, Edna Lomsky-Feder. It's really an army of peoples. That's the wider implication. It's an arena within which various communities assert their individual identities. If I can just refer to the article which Eyal wrote with Edna Lomsky-Feder, the people in uniform, from the people, I haven't got my spectrum, from the people in uniform to different uniforms for the people, right? Which I thought was really bang on, because what it showed was, in fact, that this whole idea of the army, you put it, the contact thesis, the socialization thesis, it doesn't work. In fact, what we're seeing is not the army as a nation binder, but the military itself as a nation divider. And that, I think, is the implication to be learned from this. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, we still have a few minutes for quick questions. Yeah, sure.
Stuart, this is really fascinating. I have two very quick questions. One, both focusing on this last argument regarding the Sheilot Uveshuvot, regarding the responsa. You make a presumption here that the numbers of questions being asked are somehow a good measure of the importance or prominence of the questions. Questions regarding observance of the Sabbath and regarding questions of, about how to observe kashrut and how to deal with these issues of who cooks your food and so on. Is it the case that they necessarily have the same importance? This is true when people do studies of court cases, right? Similar issues arise. It's not surprising that daily life would be reflected more in the kinds of questions that are being asked. What may be more interesting, and you yourself indicate this, I think you sort of toned it down a little bit in the presentation, I think you used the word dramatically. The number of questions regarding disengagement rose dramatically prior to disengagement. The relative trend suggested that this was certainly quite important. Why would you ask a question about disengagement when it's not immediately on the radar screen? And even so, it may be that, if 3% or 10%, that may be a huge change. And it may be that those questions are far more important. So, in order for me to be persuaded by this evidence, I guess I would want to know more about the methodology that allows you to say that numbers alone are critical. The second question I had is that you sort of laid out three stories, right? So the IDF preparation, the lack of unity among the rabbis, and then this question of what are the religious soldiers' primary concerns. And there's at least, again, an implication in the paper, but not here. You sort of say most decisively. That number three, this third story that is most distinctive and interesting, really, of course, as you suggest, is more important than the first two. But then I would have expected you to make an argument as to why the first two are somehow insufficient to actually yield that outcome. So what is wrong with what is the inadequacy of those arguments that should lead us as your listeners and readers to be skeptical of those who would say it's all about IDF preparations or lack of unity among religious rabbis or among the rabbis or whatnot. So how do you understand sort of the necessity and sufficiency of these various arguments?
Right. With regard to the first, the methodological issue. First of all, I think the numbers do count. You have to be careful because what I have are numbers which are published. I don't have numbers which are numbers of the raw materials. So maybe there's some editorial work going on. Maybe I have to be careful. I admit that there are certain.
Right, and on controversial questions, maybe less this one. Rabbis very often will give private.
Unless you take into account the fact that many of the people who write these books have expressed their opinions, which are in fact were in favour of conscientious objections. I would expect them to publish more response in that field. The first thing is that numbers do count. Second of all, I think that if you get from various sources, there's not one book, it's not two books, it's not three books. We're talking about many. We're talking about at least 3 internet sites. We're talking about each of the 24 Hesdei Yeshivot publish their own weekly or monthly newsletters, which also contain some of this material. We're taking from a number of sources. I think when you have that range, I think, and it all tells you the same thing, I think you can be convinced. The second, in regard to the second question, why shouldn't the first 2 answers be sufficient? Why do I need the third? I think I need the third. Well, I was trained as a historian. I need the third because it's there. I can't ignore it. It would be, I think, doing a disservice to history were we to ignore data simply because I don't need it. It exists. It's part of the puzzle. And I'm not sure I would say the third is more decisive than the first 2. I don't know. It's more interesting than the first 2. It's less well known perhaps than the first 2. But it's there. Perhaps as a historian, I just feel it a duty to. It's not as it was, but as I see, the evidence is simply shouting at me, and I think it would be wrong not to use it.
Historians and social scientists.
I don't know many. Rebecca?
I think Orna's point is a good one. If a lot of these soldiers are coming from the settlements, how do they justify objecting to the military and maintaining allegiance to their commanders? What's going on in their heads that basically arrives at your conclusion that they will obey for the most part?
That they will?
That they will obey and that they will not.
Well, they did obey. I don't know what will. I'm just saying did. I think will, by the way, is contingent. Obviously, everybody's got in mind what's going to happen the next time round, right? Well, what's going to happen the next time round is going to be determined very much by how the IDF treats these people in the meantime. So, for instance, this is not what you asked, but I just said it just to get it off my chest. For instance, if the IDF were to disband, for argument's sake, to disband Hesdei units, just like that, which is not going to do, or were the IDF to insist upon mixed gender units and not allow religious troops to object to this or find it difficult not to serve in separated units, were the IDF? If they were to, then I think these people feel themselves so much in a corner for those reasons that then they would be far more prepared to disobey orders with regard to settlement. But it's not the settlement which is the issue, it's the lifestyle which is the issue. That's how I see it for the future. Now, why did people who lived on the settlements, or whose families lived on the settlements, not I think because they were convinced by the argument that there are more important issues, such as state sovereignty, which is a meta-halakhic issue. Or they were convinced by the argument that if we do disobey orders, then the whole of the fabric of society is going to fall apart, and look what this will do to the Jewish people. They were convinced by the argument that we have taken an oath to obey orders, and that there were arguments on the other side, and there are more important things than this. Why didn't the settlers themselves react more violently? I think many of them for the same reasons. That, when push came to shove, and having tried every other trick in the book, when push came to shove, that was it. Now, again, I'm not saying this is going to happen next time around. It depends very much on how these soldiers and how this segment of society feels vis-a-vis general society next time round. And if they feel that they've been so isolated or so pushed into a corner in fields of education, Dovrat, and so on, that really, in any case, they've got nothing to lose, then they might do other things. It's not. I'm saying that the pundits were right, but for the wrong reasons.
Okay. Thank you for time's up. Thank you for our 4 panelists, and we invite all members of the workshop and the presenters to room 323. And for the rest, tomorrow we continue with the 3rd and 4th panel. You're all invited. Thank you very much.